So with the clutch removed from this input shaft, with the oil filter removed from the crankshaft of this particular engine on the right hand side, we've also removed the oil pump from here, that little round spacing. We can now gain access to and see the gear change mechanism. So this is this unit here. It's this little mechanism here which is responsible for changing the gears. So this little gear change mechanism it's on the end of a shaft. Okay, so I can pull it out, move it in and out like this. So the gear change mechanism is on the end of a shaft. So this shaft is a metal bar that runs through the center of the motorcycle engine. So it starts here, and if I turn the engine around, we can see on the other side that the gear change mechanism shaft comes out here. So this is it here, okay? And it is on here. We normally, when this engine is installed in the motorcycle engine, we will have our gear change foot pedal will be attached on here. So in normal circumstances, when we want to change gear, we will press the pedal down once to put it from neutral into first gear. Okay, so let's replicate that with this particular engine. Okay, so I don't have a gear shift lever to do that. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to do this manually. I'm going to have to replicate the motion of the gear change mechanism. I'm going to use just this little bit of a chisel. Okay, it's just a blunt chisel, and I'm going to use that to lever down on the gear change mechanism. So with this unit on the end of the shaft, when we push down on the pedal on the other side, gear change pedal, it's going to push this unit down. Okay, so before I push it down, I just want to show you the whole point of the gear change mechanism, or the whole point of the gearing, is to connect essentially the input shaft to the output shaft. So the input shaft here, as we can see, and then the output shaft is on the other side, or the end of it is on the other side, and on the other end of it is this sprocket. Okay, and this sprocket is the front sprocket that will be again connected to the chain on the motorcycle, which runs to the back, the rear sprocket, which drives the rear wheel. So when I turn this, at the moment when I turn this input shaft like so, let me just show you on this side. So I'm going to turn that input shaft, and you're going to see that there is no motion on the rear sprocket. That's because the motorcycle is in neutral. So the gears are in neutral. That means that the gears on the input shaft are not locked into the gears or meshed in with the gears on the output shaft to allow them to turn together. So I'm going to push down as I would. I'm just going to replicate it. So let me just do a little bit of a close-up here so we can see it a little bit better, just so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay. So let's take a look. Let's replicate this motion. So I'm going to push down with on the gear change pedal, my left foot, and it's going to push down on this gear change mechanism. It's going to cause it to move downwards. So push. Okay, so as you can see here, the gear change mechanism acts on this little gear change cam, or this little gear, the gear change cam. So it's this little star-shaped metal piece which is bolted on here. Okay, so it's not fully in gear. So now it has changed gear, as you can see there. So I just did a little bit of a motion on the input shaft, which just completed the motion of the gear change cam. And what you saw moving here at in front of the gear change mechanism is called the stopper arm. Okay, so now it's in first gear because I've pushed down. Okay, so when I turn the input shaft like so, I can feel resistance, and that's because the gears are meshed from the input shaft with the output shaft, and it's causing the rear sprocket to move. So there we have our rear sprocket moving when I turn the input shaft. So it's in first gear. Now we know that when we put it into first gear by shifting down, we cannot shift down any further. Okay? So if I try to push this down again, I can only barely move it. Okay? So to go into second gear, I have to put my foot underneath the little pedal on the left hand side, the gear change pedal, and as you know, you pull on your clutch lever and you shift the pedal up. Okay? And to replicate that motion, I'm just going to move the gear change mechanism up. Okay? Now, on modern motorcycles, neutral is between first and second gear. So that means that you actually go from first to neutral to second. Okay? Now, on most modern motorcycles, the motion, when you do that one shift, if you do a complete shift, one full shift, you will actually shift it into second gear. If you do a half shift, a half motion with your left foot on the gear shift pedal, you will put it into neutral. So when you do a full gear change, okay, so a half motion will essentially put it back to neutral. So we can move it up. So there we saw that motion, and it comes back down. So the gear change mechanism comes back down because there is a spring inside here, which I'll show you in a minute. It's called the return spring. So it always forces the gear change mechanism to go back to this position that you see it in here. So it's not actually acting on the gear change cam in normal circumstances. It's only when you're changing gear. So now it's gone back to neutral. So when I turn this, I can feel no motion on the sprocket. So it's back to neutral. So that's equivalent to the half shift. Now a full shift would have moved it. So this is putting it into second gear. So now it's in second gear, or it's not entirely. The gear change cam is a little star shape, and one of the points of the star, the stopper arm is sitting on it. Okay, so it's not fully in gear yet. Okay, sorry, there it is. Now it's gone back fully into gear. So now I can pull out the gear change cam, or the gear change mechanism, and so you can see it. So I just want to see it goes. The stopper arm is rolling over the little splines on the gear change cam. Okay, so it wants to go from here to here. Okay, so it wants to go from there to sit in here, but it has to travel over this little hill on or spline on the gear change cam. So when it sits on top of that gear change cam, it's not fully in gear. Okay, so a little motion of the input shaft usually will just click it into gear. Get it, so it's in gear there now. Once it's sitting in a little trough of the star. Okay, so now it's in second gear. Again, I'm going to move it back up one more to put it from second to third. So watch it again. So the whole motion, initially it looks like it's moving quite slowly, but it just clicks into place. So it's now gone from second to third, and let's do it one more time. So you can see the stopper arm moving out as it's travelling over, and now it's gone from third to fourth. Sorry. Okay, so I'm in top gear there now. So it's actually, maybe it's a 5-speed transmission, sorry. So it's now in top gear. Okay, so I cannot move it any further. So I'm in top gear, and now I can only move it down gears. So let's start moving it down the gears. Okay, so and then just to note that when I turn the input shaft again here, through all these gears, I can feel that the sprocket is moving on the other side. So the gears are all meshed up between the input shaft and the output shaft, and the sprocket turns. So to go back down the gears, I start pressing the gear shift pedal with my left foot downwards. Okay, so let's move the gear shift mechanism downwards. Okay, so you can see it moving a little bit better there, hopefully. Hopefully my hand is not in the way. It's quite stiff to move. It's not an easy motion to make or to replicate with this chisel. Okay, so I've gone down a gear. I can go down a gear again. And back down a gear. Again, the gear shift mechanism comes back. It always returns to the same place. Let's shift down a gear again. So again, it's sitting on top of the star. So this was what I was talking about. You can see it there. It's sitting on top of the star. Okay. Okay, and that motion of the input shaft gets it to just fall into gear properly. Okay. So I put my gear change mechanism back, and I shift gear down again. Okay. Now I can determine. I don't know what gear I'm in here, so let's go and look on this side. Okay, so again, by turning my input shaft, the rear sprocket is just staying in as it is. So it's now back in neutral. So we're now back in neutral. And that's just how the gear change mechanism works. So let's pull it out and let's explain it in a little bit more detail. How does it all work? So the gear change mechanism on the shaft, I can actually pull it out. I can disconnect on a normal motorcycle if you just remove the clutch cover normally. Remove the gear change pedal from the gear change shaft. We can actually pull this unit the whole way through. So I'm going to pull it the whole way through. Okay. The only thing you want to do. Okay, so there we go. That's a pull the whole way through. The only thing you want to make sure is that where the gear shift pedal goes on, make sure that that's thoroughly clean, because as you're pulling it through the engine, it's passing through the middle of the engine. You it's actually sitting in the sump of the engine to a degree, you know, the oil. You don't want dirt getting into the oil of your engine, okay, or into the bottom of the engine. So this is our gear change mechanism, okay. So what you need to know on here, this is the return spring. The return spring fits in here, so it has two little lobes on it, so 1 and 2, okay. So if I shift up a gear or shift down, this little, you can see the motion there, it's really stiff. Same on this one. When you do that gear shift and you move this, it pushes, that little spring pushes on this little bit of metal which is cast in the engine. Okay, so it's not going anywhere. So when you put that pressure on, change gear, it wants to, the pressure of this spring returns it back to where it wants to be. So it just wants to be sitting here with that little bit of metal. A little bit of metal will just sit in here, and it will always want to return back to the same spot. Okay. Now also to note on the gear change mechanism, it's not as transparent, but we have two poles. They're called PAWLS, and these two poles are what act on, so it's basically the edges here. Sometimes it's like a little tooth that sticks out, it might be more pronounced, but in this case the poles on this gear change mechanism, they sit in here and they act on the, they basically push on this. Okay, so I don't know if I can, no, I can easily replicate it. So the poles just push on here. Okay, and then the same here, when you're coming back up the gears, the pawl will push this way. Okay, the arm acts on the gear change cam, and the two of them are actually held on with little bolts. Okay, so I'm going to undo the two bolts here, and I'm going to remove these two pieces. Okay, so I've got my 10 socket and my ratchet out, and before I disconnect or undo the bolt that secures the gear change cam, I'm just going to replicate the motion just with the gear shifter removed. So with the bolt, with the socket on the bolt, I can rotate the gear change cam. So I just want to show you that motion. So there it is, you can see it hopefully clear enough. Hopefully my hand's out of the way. So it travelled, the stopper arm travels over. Okay, so it actually gets slightly stuck there, and it will stay there until I actually turn on the input shaft. So in normal circumstances, when the bike is running, that input shaft will be turning, so that won't be a problem, so it won't get stuck generally. Okay, and that's it, the motion in the opposite direction. Let me do it quickly again as I move through the gears. So again, sticking a little. Okay, so now it's in first, that's first gear. That's neutral. Yeah, that's neutral. Keep going down through the gears. Second. Third. Fourth. And fifth. Okay, so at that stage I can't turn it any further. So now I'm just going to open up the bolt. Okay, try and keep it steady. Okay. Okay, that bolt is undone, and I'm going to do the bolt on the stopper arm. So the bolt holding the stopper arm is I suppose it's called a pivot bolt, because the stopper arm pivots on it. Okay, so I just want to remove this carefully. I'll just take a little bit of a rag just to make sure that that stopper arm doesn't. Okay, so there we go. So you can see on the gear change cam there's a little hole in it here. So the screw goes through here to secure it onto the shaft. Okay, but there is also a little hole here, and there is actually a little pin on this just here. And this pin connects in here, and that's what secures. So as the cam is turning, it brings this shaft to rotate with it. Okay, so we'll leave that to the side just for a second. Let's remove our stopper arm the rest of the way. Okay, I think that's most of the tension off the spring. Okay. Still a little bit maybe. Okay, here we go. So that's our stopper arm. Okay. And this is our spring. So the stopper arm sits in the spring like that. Here's the little pin which can be removed, okay, and that's our inlet to the transmission. So that's it, that's the gear change mechanism.